Final Week Cricket Podcast, Adam Collins and Jeff Lemon. With us today to talk about the Independent Commission for Equity in Cricket report is Yas Rana, who these days is the head of content at Wisden.com and hosts the outstanding Wisden Cricket Weekly podcast. When we first met you, Yas, you looked after Jeff and me on the other side of the world when we were making our broadcast in the UAE, those two test matches in 2018 but between Australia and Pakistan. You were but a friendly voice down the line cutting up clips for us, and look how you've risen.
Yeah, I mean, it was a baptism of fire. I think I was about a month into working full time in cricket, and this ambitious project that you and Jeff got off the ground needed a bit of support back from the UK, and I didn't really know what I was doing, but it was very exciting to be a part of it. And you see it in your SEN commentary these days. I guess that the foundations of that were in that tour to the UAE back in 2018.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, and we're always grateful for it. And as I said, you host the Wisden Cricket Weekly podcast, which I can recommend. And I know you've done a lot on this conversation point we're about to move to. But we thought that you've had an important voice in this discussion in the last couple of years, and wanted to have you on to talk about what came out last week from the ICEC and the ECB's response and all the rest of it. So I thought to start, what might be useful is just to frame up what this report is. What was the conceit? When was the report commissioned? And the types of people who are working as commissioners?
I think the name most recognisable to cricket fans would be Yas Rana. So he obviously played a bit of Test cricket for England in 2016. Quit the game. He's one of the authors of the report. I think the report is very appropriately named. It's called "Holding Up a Mirror to Cricket." So it's putting into focus warts that the game has always had, but we've perhaps been blind to. And I think that racism has obviously been the ism that has been in the focus of the media over the last few years, ever since the Azim Rafiq story came to the forefront. But this report, I was pleasantly surprised by how much it didn't just focus on racism, but also on sexism and elitism and classism. And it was really specific in identifying structural problems that relate to sexism and elitism, and also in terms of how we can actually move forward. It was very specific. I think sometimes you can be quite philosophical in these things, but the report has really held the ECB to account. I think it's one of those things that the ECB will apologise, and have apologised, and they'll make grand statements now, but there are very specific things the report recommends that the ECB have been given a timeline on. So I think in years to come, we can look at the ECB's actions and compare it to what the report has actually recommended. And that would be something hard for us to judge the ECB on, which I think is really important. I think sometimes you don't quite have the specificity in reports like this, but this one definitely does have that.
Yeah, that's what jumped out at me as well. And given that, I mean, something like this report, it can fall under the category of like, yeah, obviously, telling us things that most people already knew if they were honest with themselves, and that some people had to deal with and other people didn't have to deal with, depending if you're being discriminated against or not. But it's when you get the personal stories, and there are thousands of responses to this report, it grounds it in reality in a way that the abstract idea that discrimination exists can remain an abstraction. It's the reality of the individual cases and when it happens to individual people. But I was sort of reading it and thinking that these are the kinds of things where people can read it and go, okay, well, that's really heavy stuff, and then nothing, and then sort of say, oh, well, what a terrible thing to read, and on you go with your life. Whereas, like you say, like the fact that there are specific recommendations and steps to take makes it optimistic that there might actually be some greater use for this beyond shining a light on something that we already knew was there.
I also think it highlights incompetence as well as outright discrimination, and how incompetence can breed discriminatory behaviour. I mean, it gives a good example. It talks about the ECB basically doing nothing for 25 years to do anything about the decline in young black players at recreational and professional level. It identifies that the ECB as an organisation in the past, and perhaps even in the present, are overly concerned with commercial revenue, perhaps in an overly short-sighted way. And even though the commercial department at the ECB over the years will say that this is important for the ECB to work as an organisation, the prioritisation of that, to the degree the ECB have prioritised that, has had other consequences, and the report identifies it. It's things like that isn't, you wouldn't look at it and say that's discrimination, but actually attitudes like that over a very long period of time do breed discrimination.
I think most people, when we knew this report was coming, thought it was going to be solely about racism. But they make a big point of saying cricket isn't a game for everyone, and that's not by chance. That's very much a pointed statement, because the ECB's corporate plan is titled, cricket's a game for everyone and all the rest of it, which is a commendable objective. But as you said in your opening passage there, it's sexism and classism, and I'm most interested in part 3, I suppose, as far as this being a topic that's finding its time. We see with Ebony Rainford Brent and the ACE program, them talking a lot about the socioeconomic inputs, if you like, to the game not being widely accessible enough. And this goes to even more depth about, for example, 58% of people that play the game come from private schools versus 7% of the population at large being from those private institutions. And effectively, pacing out that private-public divide, if you like, or the government-state school compared to the private schools, as they're called over here. It feels like this is a discussion that's finally really found its time.
Definitely. I think part of the strength of the report is just really highlighting things we always have known, but actually putting it down in writing. So some of the things that are actually really uncomfortable. 93% of the UK population are state educated. To have 58% of the professional game to be privately educated is outrageous. It's totally outrageous. And some of it, it's worth saying, is out of ECB control. The selling off of playing fields in the 80s and 90s is not only huge in this, but also really difficult to reverse. There's the free-to-air television debate. Obviously, the Sky money is crucial to the ECB. But I don't know, I've been thinking this Ashes series, compare it to football. The biggest football, a lot of football's on Sky Sports, right? So the whole entirety of the Premier League in the UK is broadcast on Sky Sports. The highlights on the BBC, sure. But the biggest football events, the European Championships and the World Cup, they're on free-to-air television. In England, at least, our equivalent, the kind of the cricket moments that create water cooler moments, are the Ashes, and none of it is on free-to-air television. And people are making a bit of a song and dance of 2.1 million people watching the climax of the Edgbaston Test match on Sky. Just imagine what that number could have been had it not been on Sky. And I think it's short-sighted that all 5 Test matches are behind a paywall. And it's things like this that, it's not outright discrimination to have the sport behind a paywall. The sport needs to make money. I'm aware of that. But for so long to not have a single men's test on free-to-air television, that makes the sport harder to access. And I think that's a big problem. And the report doesn't specifically identify it, but it specifically identifies the long-term consequence of kind of ignoring these issues. So at the very least, I hope it starts a discussion at the ECB that hasn't been had in recent years.
It felt very symbolic that it came out during the week of the Lord's Test, and then everything that was happening at Lord's during the week. We've talked about the MCC being a sort of an unexpectedly progressive organisation in the last couple of decades, but you've got a members club that didn't admit women until 25 years ago. The numbers floating around this week, I saw it was something like a few hundred MCC members who are women compared to all of the rest of the spots being taken up by men. And then the optics of this week of the members in the long room, a fairly monocultural sort of looking group every time they cut to the long room with the players going in and out, and then the way that went off the rails on the 5th day with some subgroup of the members getting stuck into the Australians because they didn't like the way they played, and particularly Usman Khawaja coming face to face with a few of them who were mouthing off at him. I mean, it was almost too much symbolism kind of compressed into the space of a few days with the report coming out, and then everything we saw about a bastion of privilege behaving exactly like a bastion of privilege.
Yeah, it's symbolic on quite a few levels. So number one, day after the report comes out, England field an all-white 11, the majority of whom are privately educated. And then at a ground that I've said for a while is impressively white for an event in London, let alone a cricket event where 30 to 40% of recreational players in Greater London are not white. And then for me, I think what was most uncomfortable was actually the comments from Strauss on the Sky commentary, essentially blaming the behaviour of the fans at the ground on the fact that tickets were cheaper. So you had people who don't usually come to Lords there, when the people Cricket Australia formally complained about were specifically MCC members. And I think that attitude is really quite depressing to come so soon after the report. And there are other elements of it as well. The MCC released a statement yesterday afternoon where they essentially said, hang on, I've got it here. They said, the long room is unique in world cricket and the great privilege of players passing through the pavilion is very special. And I was kind of like, what? Sorry, it's the other way around. Lords and its members privilege to get that sort of access to players. It's a great privilege for members to see the players, and they've misused that responsibility. I mean, personally, like one of the recommendations in the report is specifically aimed at the MCC. Recommendation 18 recommends that Eton Harrow games, Oxford and Cambridge games should no longer be played at Lords after this year, and they should be replaced by national finals days for state school under 15 competitions, both boys and girls. Personally, I think in the media we need to stop calling Lords the home of cricket. It just isn't, and it hasn't been in my lifetime. It hasn't done enough to justify maintaining that tag. I'm aware that the MCC, the organisation, the staff there do a lot of good work, but at the end of the day, you know, Adam, Jeff, you go to test matches all around the UK, it is noticeably lacking in diversity, and it has been the case for ages. And what I think for me, Test cricket in England, you're getting 6 tests a summer compared to 7 tests a summer. 2 of them are still being held at Lords. So a third of your tests are playing at one ground. And I think there needs that should be a conversation. Should Lords get a third of English home test matches? I'm really not sure they're doing enough to open the doors to a wider audience. And I think the behaviour we saw in the long run particularly, I personally, feel free to disagree. I don't really have a massive issue with the crowd from afar saying what they were doing. Obviously, individual stuff they say isn't great. But when you have that proximity to the players, there's the personal element that is just completely different. And that behaviour was really poor. And the timing of that with everything else that's going around, I thought was just quite interesting, because we're a week after the report, and has anything changed? Have attitudes really changed? You had a former England captain saying what he said. So I think it's been an interesting few days, and potentially a little bit depressing, I think, because if things haven't changed this quickly, when will they change?
And a key part of that, those crowds at those 2 test matches being played at Lords each summer, is that if you want to buy a ticket to that game, well, £180 maybe if you're lucky, let alone what the scalpers are charging outside. There's such a barrier to entry that says that if you're not already wealthy, there is no way you can afford to pay that kind of money for a day's entertainment at a sporting match.
And it's analogous to the pathways as well, isn't it? So you got that at the elite level to watch, but to be on a pathway as it is, it's pretty clear from the report that being privately educated is necessary to be front and centre to play professional cricket, right? So I mean that comes in the recommendation section too, about having a more egalitarian, flat structure, so that, or basically taking fees away from it, so that players can come through and get access in the same way that Jeff's describing, for patrons having access to watch elite cricket.
Yeah, definitely. I think it specifically identifies that as an issue, but I think that's a really hard problem to still solve, because what you have is you've got kids who will be privately coached one-to-one by coaches who also work at counties, and we've got ourselves into a situation where the importance of private schools in the production of English cricketers is just way too high. It's really skewed. The development of elite batters, they almost always go to private schools. That's really weird. And I don't think it is as simple as just saying that the pathway structure needs to be more meritocratic. There's a structural thing going on there, because if you're a 15-year-old Ollie Pope, whatever, you're exposed to such a high level of professionalism really early on, and in a way that you can't really create at the moment outside the school system, or hasn't been in recent times in England. So it's important that they've identified that, but I think it's not actually that straightforward to solve. Well, I mean, sorry, go on.
Just that it's always going to be that way if somebody's able to afford sort of one-on-one tuition, one-on-one coaching in any endeavour, then they're likely to have a massive advantage. So, it's like the soft cap for sporting clubs. There may only be a certain amount you're allowed to pay players, but you can pay more to support the facilities around them, to help give them a head start. So there's always going to be an advantage to some degree. For the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to make it. That's the same in artistic pursuits, creative pursuits, as it is in sporting pursuits.
Almost to flip it on you guys, how much of what you saw in the report chimed with your experiences in Australia? Is it noticeably better in Australia?
Good question. I think the difference with Australian cricket is that from the minute you exit the womb, it's like a big part of your life. For most people, not everyone, but for most people, cricket, it kind of seeps into your consciousness. So I don't think that the challenges in Australia go to accessing the game necessarily. The game's just part of being Australian. And that comes through in lots of ways. I was, in fact, talking about this on the Daily Show yesterday in a different context. But nevertheless, I do think that is, it's always felt to me like a relatively working class sport, with, of course, privilege in there too, built in at the higher levels, private schools as well. But I've never felt like class has been a barrier for entry, nor is necessarily being from a what would be known over here BAME background either. Like I think about the club I grew up at, for instance, and that was all competitive, recreational, but competitive nevertheless. Cricket and the pathways may not quite have the same representation all the way through with Asian players, and certainly not with Indigenous players. And Jeff's done a lot of work on that. But I don't think the problems are as obvious and as acute as the ones being spelled out in the report. But I'd be surprised if they did a report like this, if they didn't find at the margins similar kind of findings, but just perhaps not dialed up to 11 like this.
I think maybe access and equity is less an issue just because of space. I always notice it when landing in an Australian city, you look out the window, you see cricket grounds everywhere. Because the cities have such big footprints, there is space. But certainly in terms of discrimination and exclusion at club levels and a recreational level, I think that problem is as entrenched and as huge, certainly from what I've heard anecdotally from players who've been through that. There was also Mick Dodson's report about 7 or 8 years ago about Indigenous participation, the lack thereof, and about the way that Indigenous players were treated in a racist way, almost across the board. So they had a lot of submissions to that report as well. And those findings were damning too. So I think the discrimination, the baked in misogyny, sexism, racism is all a feature of Australian cricket as much as it is a feature of English cricket. It's maybe that the class aspect is less entrenched.
Yeah, maybe less at the start, but maybe more as you get into it. What you're saying there, Jeff, like I could think of some examples in my time playing cricket with guys I played with from subcontinental backgrounds who were clearly racially vilified and left my club, which, I remember it acutely. I remember it explicitly being the case only as recently as, in one case, it would have been 11 or 12 years ago. So that's not a long time ago, right, in the context of what we're describing here. But yeah, the women's cricket piece to this is the other one. Like I didn't think when we had this report land, there was going to be a huge section on sexism. That just didn't strike me as, I didn't think it was in the remit. That's my naivety here, by the way. I didn't realise that this was going to be something that the ICEC took on, but describing women's cricket as an add-on and having a series of recommendations about equity in pay out to 2029, which is a pretty short window, right? In the next 6 years, trying to level the playing field almost entirely when it comes to pay for women playing professionally in England compared to the men. That's going to obviously cost a lot of money, but I don't think we've had that argument advanced in such a sophisticated way before. Usually, I think that in women's cricket covering it, we've seen big steps in the right direction as that alone, rather than in the broader framework of half the population being discriminated against.
Yeah, definitely. I think what I really liked about the recommendations around equal pay is that I think it's been put forward in a way that's not naive. It's outlined a very workable timeline for how it can be achieved. I think that the way in which women's cricket is talked about, there's a certain generation of players, maybe from Heather Knight's generation and above, who, when they talk about the advances of women's game, always talk about how grateful they are because of how much they have personally seen it change, how they've seen it go firsthand from being totally amateur to professional. But you're getting a new generation who are coming through, someone like Alice Capsey, who when she's 16, she's being paid to play domestic cricket. So the expectations and experience are very, very different. And I think specifically on the 100 is being asked to give equal pay by 2025. That's only 2 years away. I think not only is that workable, I think it's overdue. Like the 100 people buy tickets for both games. The women are used as much, if not more so than the men, for all the promotional stuff that goes out around it. I mean, we saw last year when the Commonwealth Games was taking place, how the 100 didn't really feel like it started until the women's competition began.
Yeah.
So that I think is completely necessary and as I said, overdue.
Yeah, and also that they can increasingly make the argument on the investment versus returns case. You had 20,000+ people attend the women's Ashes Test match. You had nearly 20,000 go to Edgbaston for the first T20. You know, we've spent the last couple of years pointing at 86,000 at the MCG for a World Cup final. You can't repeat that week in, week out. But those numbers, you know, getting those sort of crowds into women's matches, that does mean that there's a potential. Well, there is a revenue possibility, and we've seen it with the WPL, the amount that they were able to sell the broadcast rights for. So that's been the argument for a few years, that women's cricket can return revenue, but we're seeing that actually happen now.
Yeah, I think there's almost an element that at some level in the ECB, people haven't really believed in women's cricket. Like literally last year, the women's test, and we know that there aren't many women's test matches. Literally last year, the women's test was held in Taunton, basically through the working week, before schools broke out for the summer holidays. It was giving it the least possible chance to succeed. And I think hopefully that this report will make sure that decisions like that are less likely to happen in the future. And it again is quite practical in how it's going to go about that. It talks about a lack of equal representation. Decisions need to be made by committees that represent the people who play the game. There aren't enough women. There aren't enough people from South Asian backgrounds. There aren't enough Black people on boards. So the people making decisions aren't representative of the people who actually play. And we keep on saying it's a game for everyone, but these aren't boards for everyone, right? And I think this is identifying that.
So there are 44 recommendations. I don't propose going through all of them, but the ECB have given themselves a 3-month window to deal with this. And the fact that Claire Connor is leading this up provides me, at least, with a lot of comfort, because we know how thorough Claire can be with everything she does, really. But the first thing they did was put out the public apology, which was recommendation number 1, the ECB to apologise for effectively past crimes, if you like, for want of a better descriptor. And Richard Thompson did that straight away in that media statement. But it includes, like, you know, benchmarking reports every 3 years on this, like a similar. I assume for that a similar report like this to be done every 3rd year. A game-wide values framework, culture health checks akin to what's done at UK Sport, racial literacy training for board members, etc. Commitment to anti-racism, which is kind of maybe it's a symbolic thing, but at least saying those words I think is important. But also not just anti-racism, anti-misogyny, anti-classist. I think that term's used as well. Equitable working conditions that we've already touched on for men and women, and that feeds into the pay and so on, and that free pathway. They're the recommendations that really jump out. So 44 of them, a 3-month window. What's your expectations of what we're going to get in 3 months' time from the ECB?
I'm really not sure, to be honest. I'm really not sure how the ECB are going to respond to this. I think the noises so far have been really positive, but I think it's easy to apologise at this point. I think difficult decisions are going to have to be made. Like as we were saying earlier, for example, stuff around free-to-air television. How are they actually going to create a structure that pays the women's game equally? How are they actually going to go about paying people what they should be paid? I mean, I think there are some things that I really think are very hard to address. So I think one of the big things that anyone who's followed the story of the last couple of years is the existence and birth of the South Asian Cricket Academy. If you take a step back, this is a ridiculous thing to exist. It's basically finding people who are actively of age to be professional cricketers, who are good enough to be professional cricketers, but for whatever reason, the system has lost out on them. There is probably unconscious bias going on somewhere in terms of these are picking up players who might have their journey to the top of the game is different. There's cultural differences in terms of how they play the game. I think it's amazing that exists and speaks volumes of a level of bias that exists. I don't know off the top of my head of examples of other sports who've managed to fix this. I'd be really interested to hear if there are examples where this sort of unconscious bias was fixed in quite a short period of time. So yeah, I reckon they'll make the right noises in terms of actually being able to change stuff. I don't think, even though I thought the report is excellent, I don't think it is actually that easy to fix a lot of this stuff. It's not easy to fix unconscious bias. And a lot of this, it must be said, these are societal issues, and cricket is part of wider society.
Yeah, that's always the line, isn't it? That is cricket any worse than society at large? But I think the fact that they go to such great lengths to say the just a few bad apples line that you hear from time to time is just not right, and that it's devastating discrimination across the board. I think that it'll be difficult for the ECB to lean back on that line that we've heard periodically. Yas Rana, you are an outstanding voice in the game. It's great to have you joining us on The Final Word to talk about this important topic. Let's make sure we do it regularly.
Absolutely, pleasure to join you both.